Hello and welcome to So What You're Saying Is. I'm Peter Whittle. Now, my guest this week is somebody that we would describe as a friend of the channel, although I'm sure that he would not consider himself a friend of any media outlet. Peter Hitchens, author and columnist, is with me this week. Welcome, Peter. His latest book is A Revolution Betrayed: How Egalitarians Wrecked the British Education System. You can see the cover of it here. It's out this coming Thursday, the 24th of November. And you can buy it on Amazon. And Peter, I imagine in bookshops, is that right?
Well, if you're very lucky, you might find it at a bookshop.
Right.
Bookshops generally don't stock my books. Very few might. Sometimes they'll order them if you ask. Cumbersome procedure. I've never in my life seen my books displayed in a bookshop. So although I love bookshops, they don't love me back. And right. I think you'll find in general, Amazon has been a great help to me and other authors like me who don't fit in with the zeitgeist and aren't approved of by people who work in bookshops. Are generally, like most people in the culture industry, people of the left, and they don't particularly want to help me. People imagine that bookshops are neutral places, just as they imagine that research is neutral. It's not true.
No, you only have to go into Waterston's or wherever now, and you see best reads, and it's virtually all kind of critical race theory or.
Well, yes, and that's of course what gets published too. And publishing is not, how shall I say, not wholly unbiased.
Yes. Well, it is available on Amazon, definitely.
Certainly should be. Yeah.
Yes. Before we talk about the book, Peter, I did want to ask you something, because it's something we have talked about before and you've talked many times about, and that's the state or otherwise of the Tory party in relation to our broader culture. The reason I mention this is there's an article by Ed West that's gone up today, just before we're recording this, and it's on Substack, What Should Small Conservatives Believe? And it goes on to say, Peter Hitchens was right all along. The Tory party needs to die. He says there comes a stage in a man's life when he puts aside childish beliefs and comes to realise that Peter Hitchens was right all along. I'm sure that doesn't give you any particular satisfaction, Peter, but...
well, the stage tends to be, or appears to be roughly a few weeks before they reach their deathbeds. It's a very, very long process that people seem to have to go through before they reach the stage of recognising that I'm right. I have been arguing this for nearly 20 years now, and it's been, I remember in the years just before the 2010 election, when David Cameron had become leader of the Conservative Party, I thought it was the most urgent thing in my life that I should persuade people that whatever they did at the 2010 election, they should not endorse David Cameron's Blairite takeover of the Labour Party and its conversion into a Blairite formation, which was what I believed then and believe now was going on. And also I thought there was no disadvantage for the British people if they didn't have a Cameron government. Even if they continued to have a Brown government, it wouldn't have been any worse. But it was an extraordinary stage in our politics where you couldn't sack the government. You get the same government however you voted in 2010, but you could sack the opposition. And if you did so, then it wouldn't magically necessarily follow that you would get a new political party, but it would create the opportunity for it. In our first past the post system, which I have to say I very strongly support, one of the parties at least has to be badly wounded before another party can arise, and that was what I was hoping for out of the 2010 election. I could not get anybody to support me. I went round other columnists, I won't name any names, begging people who I thought might see the point to support me in this, because I was a lone voice. I remember Intelligence Squared ran a debate very kindly and generously in which I was going to put this case. And Michael Gove, to his credit, was prepared to speak against me. And what actually happened was that my partner on my side of the debate pulled out at the last minute. I won't say who it was, because he's no longer with us, but I regard it as one of the most disgraceful things anyone's ever done to me. And I was left with someone having to partner me who was just doing it as a professional debater, because we had to have it. I could not get any support for a position which I now find week by week more and more people come to see was right. And also I remember a meeting of the Bruges group at the Tory party conference, I think of autumn 2009 in Manchester, where I spoke on the same theme, and the temperature of the room dropped while I was speaking, because nobody wanted to hear what I had to say at the time. And there was a huge, ridiculous belief that David Cameron, despite the obvious fact that he was in fact a metropolitan liberal public relations man, that he was actually going to be a Conservative Prime Minister, and they would not be shaken from it. Tribal loyalty trumped thought. And so there we are. So whenever anybody says, well, it's wonderful to see that people now realise that you're right, I say, well, it isn't actually. It's far too late. There was an opportunity, a real opportunity in 2010. I think there was still enough intellectual and political muscle in the country to create a genuinely sensible Conservative formation to replace the ruins of the Tory party. But I think that time has gone now, and I very much fear that if the Tory party now collapses, as it well may, it will be replaced by something pretty ropey.
Because of the lack of intellectual...
Yeah, this isn't any. No one's been thinking about it. The level of our education has been declining. The actual people available in our society to sustain it have been going into retirement or dying. I don't think there is the intellectual force and mind left in the country to create the sort of formation which could do the job properly, which would be as concerned about liberty and justice and law as it was about patriotism and about the welfare of the people. Huge issues on which a proper Conservative party needs to be right to both to succeed and to do its duty.
You know, you said that there was a dip in the temperature when you talked about it back then.
Yeah.
You recently spoke, was it the Oxford Union, sorry, or it was one of the Roger Scruton
It was
lectures?
one of the Roger Scruton lectures, yeah.
And you did talk about it then, didn't you?
Oh, I did, yes, but in a sort of elegiac way.
Yes.
It's very much as a cause which had been lost to the detriment of the country and our culture.
I noticed with that, I watched the interview afterwards as well with Daniel.
Oh, yes, and it was pitiful.
Yeah.
I'm afraid Daniel Hannan revealed himself. It was like being interviewed by Owen Jones.
Yes.
Only less entertaining.
Yes.
It's extraordinary, and people think of people such as Daniel Hannan, who doubtless is a perfectly nice person and kind to animals, but they think of him as some sort of conservative. He's plainly not remotely conservative on any actual important issue, but a liberal of some kind, as so many people are now trading under a conservative banner are. It's worth watching the thing, to watch the Hannan interview officers, to see how somebody can sit through an event of that kind and not have a clue about what's just been said.
Yes. He seemed just sort of irritated. That was...
He was, yes. But I've had the same questioning about when the questioning began. I realised that he was basically taking the view that what I had been saying for the past 20 odd years is that the country was materially worse off, and my whole point has been that we're morally worse off. And if you're morally worse off, actually, in the end, you will be materially worse off as well. As we are now discovering, our moral failures are, I think, one of the main reasons for our rapid impoverishment.
Yes.
But it wasn't. It's never been a question about child mortality rates or things of that kind which he raised. It's always been a question about moral poverty, and he simply hadn't grasped that. And here's the thing: I bumped into him on the train on the way up, and offered him a copy of the lecture, and he turned down the offer. So
Really? I think I would completely agree with you there. I think there is this sort of, as you say, this emphasis on the material. It's like when I read every year, it's a similar kind of editorial they do in The Spectator about how everyone is so much better off. And you sort of think, well, in that case, why are people so unhappy?
Well, happiness is a very hard thing to pursue, as the Americans have found. But yes, but then again, if you say that child mortality has fallen, which it has done for many reasons, and could equally well, in my view, have fallen under a properly conservative form of government, what you must also mention then is the huge rise in the number of children who are aborted in the womb. If you're worried about child mortality, then that presumably must concern you. And it is a point at which moral poverty crosses with material progress.
200,000.
I think it's something like that now. We haven't reached the stage that the Soviet Union reached, where the number of abortions outnumbered live births, but it's pretty bad. And also the figures are now disguised by the fact that the use of the morning after pill is preventing many pregnancies from reaching the point at which they can be aborted in the first place. But it is undoubtedly it's the same thing. It's the destruction of human life in the womb for the convenience of adults.
Just before we go on to,
but we don't want to discuss that.
Just before we go on to
it's another interview.
Before we go into the book, I just want to pick up something that you said that you were a great supporter of first past the post.
Yes.
So, because when we have these endless discussions about what happens next, as you tend to do in these waters around here, people say, the only chance is for some form of proportional representation.
It's a bizarre thing to say. Every proportional representation system I've ever seen produces an arrangement whereby there are a number of small parties which coalesce after the election, often in ways they haven't warned anybody of beforehand, and that those parties are dominated by parties of the liberal left, or the Christian Democrat region, which is pretty much indistinguishable from the liberal left. You might get a so-called right-wing party taking part in one of these coalitions and getting a few ministerial posts in it, but it won't run it. The whole thing about first past the post is it forms coalitions before elections. And it's perfectly possible for intelligent conservatism to produce a coalition. And I'm still amazed that in this country there has never been a go-list party, which is, that's to say, strongly social democratic on welfare and public services, and strongly patriotic abroad, and generally culturally conservative and morally conservative in its nature. I believe such a party, if it existed, would sweep the board. But in a proportional representation system, it wouldn't, because its elements would be divided up. And that's what they all... It can take, sometimes I think, more than a year in Belgium it's taken them to form coalitions out of their multi-parties. I don't know, the only thing that would appeal to it for a supposedly right-wing party would be that such a party would, of course, get state aid and would be able to build offices and employ people, and also its leaders, because of closed list systems, would be guaranteed permanent political careers. But that's a concern for them, it's not a concern for the country. You would never get, I think only once in Germany since the war has there been a majority. I think Adenauer got an actual parliamentary majority in the Bundestag. Every other German government has been a coalition of one kind or another. You would never get the ability to throw out an unpopular government, which to me is vital for political stability. And you would never get a chance in between elections for strong government either. It would always be a salad. And it's amazing how so many people on the right seem to have fallen for PR. It's going to make it very difficult for them to resist when Keir Starmer does what I think he will do if he wins or becomes the largest single party at the next election, which is to go for it.
Well, actually, yes. So basically, what would happen if we have first past the post? We don't have any PR and all of that. Essentially, the Tory party, you say it's too late. Come the next election, what are we going to have? What do you see happening?
If the Tory party collapsed, then you would obviously have a period between its collapse and the creation of something else. And that's another reason why it should have happened a long time ago. You can't immediately create it. But as I say, I would have striven very hard for the creation of a British Gaullist party of the sort I just described. And I think that there is, you look at people like the existing Social Democratic Party, it's very appealing in many ways and has a lot of those elements to it. At the moment, it's a train set rather than a railway, because it's so small and has no money and very little broadcasting access. But if the Conservative Party were gone and there was a space, a party of that kind might well fill it.
Yes, I mean it is. I've spoken at the conference quite recently, and
lots of people have. I'd say they say some intelligent things, and they've understood an important fact. It is not necessary for Conservatives to be unpleasant to poor people. On the contrary, conservatism appeals to many people on the old-fashioned left. The old really pre-Wilson Labour Party was an extremely socially conservative party.
Yeah. Oh, actually, yes. My own parents are a perfect example of that. Labour voters who. With the book "A Revolution Betrayed," Peter, I want to start. It basically takes in about a century, doesn't it? I mean, the past century.
Yeah, it tries to set into context the whole thing, which is a bigger event than people realise. and a more startling one. So I go back a bit to the origins of the grammar schools themselves, before they became free for that brief and wonderful period between 1944 and 1965, when we actually had really good state secondary education available to a lot of people who couldn't otherwise have afforded it. But they had an existence before that, which seems to be worth. I mean, it's amusing to note that the original founding statutes of Eton College describe it as a grammar school, and the divide between the grammar schools and the so-called public schools, the big fee-charging schools, is not an educational one. It's basically a divide of snobbery. The decision of those schools, the Clarendon schools, to become boarding schools rather than day schools, made them basically snob schools, whereas the grammar schools remained actually pretty classless, which was a good thing in my view.
Yes, I mean, it's very near to my heart, actually, because when I was reading the chronology that you set out in the book, and also the arguments, my own sort of family's experience came in and out of it, threaded in and out in my mind. Just one thing, I went to a grammar school called Roan School for Boys. There was a girls' school, similarly, Roan School for Girls, just down the road in Greenwich. Old, 300 years old. What do you call public school pretensions, if you want, you know. In 1977, it was going to go comprehensive, and essentially there was a public meeting. Parents were very angry about it on the whole. They were being told why this happened. Could you explain, I'm just using that as one sort of moment in time, what was happening there?
Well, by 1977, it was pretty much all up, and there were a few local authorities which resisted. The government did not take powers, probably could not lawfully have taken powers in 1965 to force grammar schools in this country to close, because education is very much a local authority concern. What they could do was put considerable political and ultimately economic pressure on local authorities to stop having grammar schools, and that began with Circular 1065. The equivalent in Scotland was much more dictatorial. They simply instructed, and within, I think, a couple of years, there were no grammar schools left in Scotland. But it wasn't an absolute decree that they should immediately be shut down. And so, but the process began and accelerated, I have to say, in 1970, when the Tories came back into office under Margaret Thatcher, because so many local authorities were fitting in with it. It's quite surprising that your school was still a grammar school in 77, because most of them had gone by then, I think.
Well, yes, this one was gone. What I think within the year I left in 77. But point was, it was Shirley Williamson who's the education secretary. But I wondered if you'd explain how long had grammar schools, in that sense, in the sense of might have been in existence until that point?
Well, many of them go back to the age of Shakespeare. Others, a lot of 16th and 17th century foundations. They were local. They were fee charging secondary schools in most cases, which took increasing numbers of scholarship boys and girls. In some of the Labour local authorities, particularly Durham in the interwar period, they were largely working class schools. So they selected on merit. There was an awful lot of scholarships. But in 1944, they became free to everybody. You didn't have to get a scholarship to get into them, but you just need to pass the 11 plus. And so they became, Evelyn Waugh described as a system of giving free education to the poor. At the same time, of course, there was this was the moment at which this country, for the first time in its history, began to offer, this is England, Scotland and Wales have different histories, began to offer secondary education to everybody. Until then, until the 44 Act, secondary education had been a minority activity, and a lot of people simply hadn't had it. They'd had an extended primary education up to 14 and then had left school. So the secondary modern schools, which came into existence at the same time, were a completely new thing. And they were utterly experimental, and that's another large part of the book, the misunderstanding of the nature of the secondary moderns, and often the slandering of them in later years as much worse schools than they in fact were. But what happened was basically that something which had been partly at least fee charging became entirely free, but entry was controlled on merit. And a huge effort was made. And there's a lot of derision at the 11 plus these days and the way in which it was drawn up, and much of it is justified because the research on which some of it was based was plainly wrong. But it was a sincere effort to avoid class prejudice. There was a real effort not to allow class prejudice to keep people out of the grammar schools. And in 1953-54, I think 65% of the pupils at grammar schools came from working class homes. Now, if you looked at the current high quality comprehensive so-called in this country, you'd struggle to find one which had anything remotely resembling that number of children from working class homes in it. It's quite an achievement. It began there are lots of other things. There are huge things which people don't even remember now. The great baby bulge, as we call it in this country. The Americans call it the baby boom. That term's taken over now. In 1956, this hits all secondary schools in the country because they started at 11, and the pressure on places became much, much greater, and as a result, competition to get into grammar schools became much greater, and more people failed the 11 plus and didn't get into them, which began to make the 11 plus unpopular and was the beginning of their political doom. Suddenly the zealots and utopians who've been campaigning for years against grammar schools, suddenly they were in step with a large chunk of middle class public opinion, and that's what basically finished them off.
But something you go into in the book is extraordinary, really, is that people who had it in for grammar schools for whatever reason didn't seem to muster the same kind of hostility to private schools.
It's very strange, isn't it, that if you were looking at privilege in education in this country, then obviously fee-charging schools where you can get an enormously better education if you're rich than if you're poor would be a major target for reform. In a free country, you can't close schools down. If you try to, they're simply set up abroad. But what you could have done, for instance, is you could have compelled the big fee-charging boarding schools to take large numbers of as it were, scholarship children. In fact, there were many very high-quality day schools which did this, the direct grant schools, including fantastically good schools such as Manchester Grammar School, who took large numbers of working-class children from ordinary state primary schools as well as fee-paying parents, and it was very successful. One of the most successful things in the British education system, and there's no reason why that couldn't have been applied to the public schools, but it wasn't. It is quite odd that all the venom and rage and destructiveness was visited on schools which were actually open to the working class.
Well, actually, it was venomous. I mean, famous, Anthony Crossland, who was Shadow Foreign Secretary, I think, at the time. He would have been obviously Education Secretary.
Yeah, he took over as Education Secretary because he the original Education Secretary, Michael Stewart, was moved to the Foreign Office.
Right.
If you remember this, Patrick Gordon Walker was defeated at Smethwick in that famous by-election.
Yeah. Who
had been going to be Foreign Secretary. This is a huge reshuffle. So Tony Crossland ended up being Education Secretary, rather to everybody's surprise, and was in charge of this revolution.
And he said famously, I quote this, by the way, I'm going to make sure to destroy every fucking...
Yes, that's right, yeah.
But did you say that shows the real kind of venom, which seemed to go over and beyond just simple...
It's extraordinary, isn't it, that someone should hate good schools. It's also a very interesting feature of this. Yes. If you're coming up with a reform of any part of institutional Britain at all, then surely what you do is you look and see what's good and you build upon it. But the comprehensivization of secondary education in Britain involves, of necessity, the destruction of something like 1,200 undoubtedly good schools, in return for which you've got the creation of several hundred new comprehensive schools whose quality nobody could be sure of until they existed. And then when they found out that they weren't very good, we'd spent the next, 60 years pretending that they were good after all, rather than saying, whoops, we made a terrible mistake, let's put this right.
You also describe, which I think is which is to an extent what we're talking about, is that there was this kind of
dislike of what grammar schools seem to represent, not just in terms of the 11 plus, but just that they had a traditionalism about them.
Oh, very much so. Some of the opponents of the grammar schools were actually members of the Communist Party of Great Britain and were devoted to the egalitarian utopian cause, and they saw grammar schools as not just a failed halfway mark, but they saw them as an obstacle to the utopia which they hoped to create. People like Brian Simon, who was one of the most intelligent and articulate advocates of what they called common schools to begin with, and it really was one of those occasions where the supposed best became the enemy of the good. They believed that the comprehensive schools would result in a kind of sunlit paradise of total equality, where all the classes mixed and the undoubted class divisions of this country were melted away, which didn't, of course, happen in reality, and that the existence of grammar schools was an obstacle to this wonderful utopia. So they wanted to get on with utopia and push it to one side. There were also people who believed that that one of the effects of grammar schools on the working class was that the people who, and there's some truth in this, the people who were lifted up by the grammar schools out of poor backgrounds, whether they're miners or weavers or whatever it was, were detached from both their families, which was true in many cases. I think there was some estrangement would sometimes take place, but were also, as it were, detached from their class roots, and in some ways almost betraying them. There's very interesting passages in some of the left-wing writing about grammar schools by people who attended them and admitted they'd had a good deal out of them, but still thought that actually they weren't a good idea. It's fascinating. There's much more to this than education. In fact, there's very little education in it at all. There's never been any research that I know of that ever showed that comprehensive education was better educationally for any purpose than selective schools.
It's interesting. In my case, the way this showed itself straight away was that they changed the name because Rome Grammar School for Boys, I think that's what it was called, became the John Roan School. That was considered to be somehow less elitist. These words were used at the time. And I think they got rid of the house system that we had and all of that.
But then a lot of grammar schools in the early years, because grammar schools began, a lot of comprehensives, I should say, a lot of comprehensives in the early years, because comprehensives began to come into being long before 1965 and the great circular 1065. A lot of the original comprehensives were quite like grammar schools in appearance: honours boards, teachers in gowns, rugby playing, and very, how shall I put it, old-fashioned, almost sort of Greyfriars atmospheres in the schools, and quite a lot of streaming as well. But very soon after that, the egalitarians said this isn't enough, and they began to demand mixed ability teaching and the end of these things. And quite quickly, because of the nature of the schools, a new head would come in, or a new education authority a new party would take over the education authority, or whatever it might be. Comprehensives, which had begun as quite formal and disciplined, became much less formal, much more mixed ability, much more genuinely comprehensive. But of course, these tended to be concentrated in the poorer areas of cities. The schools which survived most with most similarity to the old grammar schools, of course, were the ones which were in the better parts of town, where people paid housing premiums to live in expensive houses. And this was understood. If you read Circular 1065 carefully, they knew when they did it that this division was going to exist between the wealthy and the less wealthy areas of cities.
Yes. So in fact, throughout a period of decades, we've ended up now with a far worse situation, haven't we? Where basically, it is down now to money, isn't it?
Very much so. I know there must be exceptions of some kind, but in general, on National Offer Day each March, your educational fate is decided largely by where your parents live. There are also the issues of religion. I mean, it is alleged, and no one can prove it, of course, that quite large numbers of parents feign religious faith to get their children into better schools. And undoubtedly a lot of the religious schools are better for reasons which are quite complicated, but there is that too. But fundamentally, National Offer Day is a huge and bitter permanent selection by wealth. Unlike the old selection by ability, there's no real appeal against that. Unless your parents win the lottery, they're going to stay in the income bracket they were in when you first went to school. Yes. So it will remain. There wasn't enough switching between schools under the old academically selective system, but there was quite a lot, and it doesn't really happen now because people still continue to live in the same area. And the Sutton Trust and Teach First have both done surveys which show clearly that the better comprehensive schools in the country are heavily socially selective towards the well-off. It's an inevitable result. No one really tries to deny it.
Yes. Actually, in the one of the appendices of the book, you do list high-achieving people who went to grammar school.
Yes, I do. Yeah.
And I mean, quite extraordinary. All areas of life. I have no data, unlike that. I have no data really to back this up, but it's just that my impression is that in the 60s and 70s, when I was growing up and at school, there was a greater feeling that you could do more than maybe you can now.
Well, this was Anthony Sampson, the great liberal journalist, in his books, The Anatomy of Britain, his series, was very taken with this. His passages on this in the books as they go on from the first to I think the fourth are more and more astonished by the way the grammar schools are conquering Oxford and Cambridge and the professions and the armed services. And there's people you look around you now. Admiral Lord West of Spithead is a grammar school boy. So is Alan Bennett, the noted playwright, and so is Alan Rickman, the great Shakespearean actor, whose father was as far as I know, a house painter. These all went to good selective state schools and rose to the very top. And quite rightly, it wasn't what the grammar schools were created for, but it is in fact what they did. And it's one of the reasons why my colleague Kiba Roy went through the relevant editions of Who's Who and found them all, because I thought it was people always saying it, but I thought it would be really nice to have a list of the people who actually made it. And it's fascinating. Scientists, lawyers, a lot of lawyers, and quite a lot of armed service people as well. It's quite important there. But people from any area of life, many people with extremely high achievement started it in a state selective grammar school in the 1940s or 1950s. It's quite tear-jerking to read.
Actually, I suppose that the media, which was growing and booming, was a great place for many of these people. I mean, you talk about Joan Bakewell. I mean,
yes,
I used to
Joan
work.
Bakewell is another fantastic example.
Yes,
who's now Baroness Bakewell and a great person in the country and an important one. She without her early years at grammar school, none of this would have happened. And very interesting passage which I recommend to people about the contrast between what happened to her and what happened to her sister, and her own slightly differing accounts of this, which have something to say about the constant mantra that the division between grammar school and secondary modern was terribly cruel and unfair. I'm not sure the story of her and her sister actually bears that out.
She was inconsistent, wasn't she?
She was, yes. I think. We can't really go through it all here, but it's a passage in the book I do recommend to people who think that it's that simple.
Do you think, actually, and this is related to that, actually, I remember that my parents, were extremely, I suppose you would call them aspirational working class, in the sense they thought education was important and they thought history was important and all of that. And I wonder whether the kids who did well at grammar school were from my kind of background. I mean, in other words, there were books around, just not libraries, just not libraries.
No one's ever really done the work on it. That's the trouble. You simply can't be sure. I think quite a lot probably weren't, but they just passed the exam and they went to the school and they were not left to struggle as they would have been in a modern comprehensive, and so they did well in things. In those days, of course, university was an extraordinarily rare destination, and I'm not absolutely convinced that was a very bad thing. It wasn't that you couldn't judge the outcome of grammar school education on whether people went to university or not. They went into professions without having to do so, and made a great impact on life. And they left school and left education earlier than people would now, because in many cases they had family pressures to go out and earn. But I don't know. I simply don't know. It wasn't, the thing was, if the grammar schools had had that purpose, then they would have had to do things like introduce maintenance grants, so that this problem of the child from a poor home who was bright but whose parents wanted him to go out to work would have been able to say, well, no, I don't need to because I'm eligible for a grant. But none of that was done. All the things which happened, thanks to grammar schools, happened in the absence of the sort of social measures you would take if you were really trying to avoid that.
Yes. Do you think that, we started by talking about the Tory party, do you think that the idea of selective education on merit is absolutely dead now? I mean, do you see it as, in the same way as you would talk about the death of conservatism? Is there, because occasionally it comes up, doesn't it? In the past 10 years, there was some half-hearted attempt to reintroduce grammar schools by the back door somehow. Right?
Well, these are always half-hearted, and the reason is the Conservative Party never really believed in the state selective schools anyway. It never really, it didn't defend them against attack. In local government, in many cases, where a lot of the comprehensives which originally sprang up not out of some utopian desire, but because it was cheaper on a big new housing estate to build one school than to build two. And so they went comprehensive. And many of the authorities which did this were certainly ostensibly conservative, so it wasn't ideological. The Conservative Party never had, even when people like David Eccles were in charge of education, an ideological or political commitment to selective state education. And most Conservative politicians at that time, I'm sure, sent their children to private fee-charging schools. It wasn't really an experience they had or understood. And when they came under attack, they didn't defend them, and they realised that the idea of bringing back some grammar schools plays well to a certain part of their voting base. So from time to time they come up with it. Actually, David Cameron was probably more honest over that than he needed to be when Graham Brady and others opposed him. He said, "Well, no, we can't go on promising this when we're not going to do it." And people will think we're ridiculous, and there's some truth in that. The Conservative repeated promises that they'll bring back grammar schools have always turned out to be false, and they never take place. I would love it if I thought it were possible to restore the grammar schools. When I originally set out on the book, I thought that I could write it as a manifesto for that programme. But the more I read about it and the more I researched, the more sure I became that it would be impossible to do. There's no political will in this country for it. Interestingly, there was very strong political will in the late 1980s and early 1990s when East Germany collapsed, and it was comprehensive, East Germany, and parents in East Germany wanted to have the same grammar schools as West Germany had, and they demanded them and got them. But only countries which have really experienced full-on egalitarianism have people in them who realise how important it is not to have it. And I don't think there's any of that kind of political force here. And also, where would you find the teachers? The quality of education which grammar schools provided was immensely higher than anything we can now conceive of. When I was growing up, in my early teens, my father worked at a school, and when I heard a lot of teachers' conversations, and you heard it said over and over again that a set of English A-levels was equivalent to an American college degree. Yeah. And at that time, there was a thing called the brain drain, where Americans were constantly recruiting, particularly scientists, from British schools and universities to go and work over there for vast salaries, far more than they get here. And people went in large numbers. It was a social phenomenon, the brain drain. And none of these things are heard of anymore. America doesn't poach our schools or our universities in that way anymore. And our A-levels are not remotely worth an American college degree. It's the plunge in the standards of our education since that era is measurable largely by the huge inflation in first of all in O-levels, which eventually had to be destroyed and replaced by the GCSE, and then with A-levels, which bear no relation to the A-levels of my school years. And of course university degrees themselves, where I think there's huge numbers of people now getting first-class degrees, which were once reserved for a tiny minority. And so it's like telling people, and people say, well, they've all got these fantastic qualifications, but then again, people in Zimbabwe were all billionaires, but they could buy a loaf of bread with a billion Zimbabwe dollars. So what did it matter? And these educational qualifications, they are Zimbabwe dollars.
You actually say, or suggest in the book, that I think the mid-60s, I think the destruction, at least the beginning of the destruction of grammar schools, was either preliminary act or the very first, most important act of cultural revolution.
I now believe so, yes. I think it made the whole thing possible. There was this preliminary cultural revolution under the Wilson government, run largely by Roy Jenkins, in declawing the criminal justice system, particularly, and destroying the police as they then were, and in undermining the existence of the married family by making divorce, how shall I put it, rather easier than it's been before. Those two particular ones come to mind. But those didn't bear fruit as cultural revolutionary actions for some time afterwards. And what made it possible for them to do so, and made it almost impossible for them to be reversed, I think, is that in the period of the 60s, the educational system ceased to produce in large numbers skeptical, thoroughly educated people who could stand up against the crowd. And I think that's one of the great losses. If you don't have an educational elite, you don't anymore have, where do your town DLs come from, the people who are prepared to say, no, this is a mistake. People who know enough to know that things are a mistake. As we've just seen in the COVID panic, there simply isn't enough weight of numbers in our governing class of people willing to say no to the crowd.
Yes.
And I think that the destruction of the grammar schools made that possible. I think what they produced was people who were capable of saying no to a crowd.
Well, as I said, Peter, I mean, it was very close to my heart to read it.
There's one small thing that you haven't touched on, which is actually quite big for me, because I wasn't really aware of it till I wrote the book. The question of the secondary moderns, and I'd known that they were better than had been said, that towards the end they were getting quite a lot of people fairly good exam results and sometimes getting people into university. But I discovered during this a tremendous book written by a man called Dick Stroud called The Secondary Mod, he attended a secondary modern and ended up doing physics at the University of Sussex, and has had a very successful career. And the research that he's done is a huge corrective to all the general propaganda of the grammar school opponents. As well, if you have the grammar schools back, you have to have the secondary moderns, and that would be terrible. It's my view, after studying Mr. Stroud's book, that I think a large number of the secondary moderns were a good deal better than a large number of the existing comprehensives on any terms. And that the idea that they were terrible schools and a national shame simply doesn't stand up to examination. They were handicapped in their opening years because they weren't even allowed to set their pupils' public examinations, can you imagine? But when that restriction was lifted, in fact, some of the schools forced their way through it. When that came to an end, they began to perform pretty well. And I don't think that the old mantra of the comprehensive people that the secondary moderns were a disaster stands up to examination at all. And as well as my own book, I hugely recommend Mr. Stroud's, which I relied on heavily in my chapters. Yeah. It's just called The Secondary Mod. It's available on as an ebook or on or from Amazon as directly. But it's not. So he's not an academic, has no academic standing. But I just thought it's a fantastic, powerful piece of research. And many, many more people should know about it and read it.
Well, thank you for that recommendation. And of course, your own book, which is Revolution Betrayed, How Egalitarians Wrecked the British Education System. Thank you very much, Peter, for talking about it. If you'd stay there, we're going to have a few questions for our exclusive members for you. But in the meantime, thank you very much for joining us. That's it for this week. We shall see you next time on So What You're Saying Is. Thank you. Hello. If you're enjoying the New Culture Forum channel and you believe in our mission, may I invite you to join our membership scheme at the link below or on our website. newcultureforum.org.uk. Our work is more important now than ever, and we have great plans ahead for the future, but we can't do it without your support. From as little as £3 per month, you can help ensure that we continue on our mission. As a member, you'll receive a range of benefits, including access to exclusive content, invitations to our private events, including here at our studios, free copies of our books, and much, much more, including, of course, our famous NCF mug. If you aren't able to become a member, then please help us by clicking this button and subscribing to our channel. It's completely free. Just remember to also click the bell icon so that you can get notifications when we post new videos. Thank you.